Let's get this mic going. You can hear me hopefully better now. And yes, so we have an hour session here for us to talk to you and for you to ask questions of us about studying classics at Oxford and Cambridge. And Andrew and I are coming from Oxford and Cambridge respectively. And in the popular press, you'll read about the rivalry, the antagonism between Oxford and Cambridge. But this is all a myth. We have great affection, great respect for one another, perhaps even love, Andrew. And our shared job, what really gets us out of bed in the morning, is infusing as many people as possible to come study the Greeks, the Romans, and their world. So we have sort of three different goals in what we'll be talking with you about today. The first is to encourage you to study a humanities degree at university. We think that's a very good thing for you to do with your lives. Secondly, we would hope that you would seriously consider classics as the subject you choose. And then finally, we would hope that if you do choose classics, Oxford or Cambridge is a place to which you will seriously consider applying. And it's a quirk of history that you're not allowed to apply to Oxford and Cambridge at the same time, okay? We're not sure quite why that is, but you can't do it. So you do have a choice to make today when it comes to whether the Oxford or Cambridge course appeals to you more. So to help us get through this session, we have a very exciting PowerPoint presentation, jointly written by Cambridge and Oxford, checked over by both of us. We're happy with what we are going to say. And I'll speak for a bit about the Cambridge side of things, and then hand over to Andrew for some more Oxonian fare. So you'll see some basic questions we're going to cover. Why classics? Perhaps some of you have studied classical subjects at school already and you feel you know what you're in for. Perhaps some of you have never had that opportunity. Well, the courses on the table for you today are open to all of you, irrespective of what you have or have not studied. We're going to say something about the structure of our courses, and it's not as though there are just two courses between us. We've probably got 7 or 8 different variants for you to consider. We'll talk briefly about teaching and learning and what's unique, or at least double unique, in Oxford and Cambridge when it comes to how we educate you. The application process, we have a few things to say, and then if you're still not convinced, we have some hard, tangible benefits of studying classics. So let's get on to the next slide, if we can do it. We can't do it yet. Let's try and really force the issue. Okay, so why study classics? In a sentence, classics is the most exciting subject to study because of its sheer scope. Geographically, temporally, culturally, it's massive. It has all of the humanities thrown into it, as well as plenty of social science. Even science forms a part of the study. So yes, we're talking about the ancient Greeks and the Romans in particular, and the very name classics as a subject comes from the literary side of it. You will know that we have millions of words surviving in Latin and ancient Greek, and these works of literature haven't survived to us completely by chance. They've survived on the basis both of their artistic and literary merit and their cultural importance. Literature was at the heart of these ancient societies. They were very driven by their written texts, and they've survived 2 or 3 millennia because subsequent cultures have seen great value in them. As you can see, there's a huge historical spread in what you would study, going from sometime in the 2nd millennium BC through to at least the mid-1st millennium AD. So not just 1,000 years, but arguably 2,000 years for you to study. Philosophy can be a major part of your degree, both at Cambridge and Oxford. Plato and Socrates and Aristotle are the names that are most obvious, but there are literally scores of ancient philosophers with rival theories about how to live and how to understand the world around us. We also study not just the languages of Latin and Greek, but how language as a whole operates, what it is to express yourself in different means and in different ways. And that's really quite a scientific angle of study in the degree. But you may be more drawn to the physical side, the material remains of the ancient world, which in the context of the Greeks and Romans survive all around us in Europe and beyond. And both Oxford and Cambridge will give you lots of opportunities to travel to the ancient lands and get your hands and knees dirty as you dig about and explore what survives of this world. Art and architecture is a major part of that. It is exceptional, which is a rather ambiguous adjective, but we've got so much of it, and it's so resonant and evocative of ancient society that whatever your tastes, you can be captivated by the art that survives. And of course, classics in particular has a close relationship with the evolution of history, at least in the Western world, over the past 2,000 years. So whatever we feel about the world we are now in, it is intimately involved with the legacy of the ancient Greeks and Romans. So studying these ancient peoples helps us understand why our modern world is as it is. Okay, so I'll start on the Cambridge side, as I say, and the simple question for you, if you're thinking about applying to the course at Cambridge, is have you studied any Latin? And if so, have you studied it to A-level or equivalent level? Maybe an IB, possibly a pre-U, maybe you were educated outside the UK and you've got a different degree. That's the fundamental question. But here's the thing, we don't really care about the answer to that question, because all of you can apply to study classics at Cambridge. The only difference is whether you feed into the 3-year course, where we know that you already have some Latin, or whether you enter a course that's 1 year longer for the essential reason that we want to teach you and skill you up, not just in Latin, but also in the Roman world more generally, so that you feed into the 3-year course, not just as if you'd done A-level, but actually with an even richer range of knowledge than the A-level course, which is restricted to Latin. So that's the difference. It's a 3 or 4 year course, depending upon your study up to this point. So let's start with the top line. It's called prelims. We're getting away from the name preliminary because we don't quite like the way it operates. But the 4-year course is open to any applicant, as I say. It may be that you're studying English literature and you're interested in studying texts. It may be that you're studying history and you've thought hard about how to understand the past. You may be studying a modern language, and that's given you an insight into how different languages express the same ideas. Or you may have studied none of those things. It really doesn't matter. All applicants who are fascinated about learning more about the ancient world are welcome. And in that first year, you would focus on learning Latin from scratch and building that knowledge into Latin literature and the Roman world. Thereafter, you would enter the 3-year course, which is where applicants who have done Latin A-level enter, and that course starts out general, and it becomes more specific based upon your own personal interests. So in the first year, that's part 1A, we throw at you the full range of things to analyze from the ancient world. There'll be ancient philosophy, history, art and archaeology, and linguistics, the study of language. And even if you personally already have favourite aspects of studying the ancient world, you've got to try a bit of everything, because we're confident we can show you ways of studying the full range of the ancient world in different approaches, different methodologies from whatever you've done at school. So we don't take it as a given that you can focus on A or B from the get-go. But as time passes and you get into your second year, you choose particular areas from that menu which appeal to you especially. And by the end of that second year, you are only being examined in the parts of classics that appeal to you and excite you. And come the final year, what we call part 2, for reasons that are no longer very clear, you choose 3 or 4 areas of study out of a menu of 30 or 40. And it's typical in the average year, where we've got 80 or 90 people, that no one person graduates with the same degree as any other classicist, for the simple reason that each student has chosen 3 or 4 specific topics that are specific to themselves. So although everyone graduates with the same degree, in actuality, they've all done a slightly different one, tailored to their interests. So what do I mean in this final, oh, come on. Yeah, there we go. There they are. Mary Beard, Robin Osborne, Carrie Vout, looking at a pot. Well, if you're in your final year, these are the kind of things you can study. And they seem quite general, but you've got the whole year, so October through to June, to get deep into these topics. You could study the great epics, the place of women in Greek literature in particular, Aristotle's huge range of philosophical interests, the prehistory of the Aegean. You can look at how classical art has been received in the medieval and Renaissance periods. You can look at sociolinguistics, how Latin was spoken in the real Roman world and not the elite microcosm of written texts. You can look at broader cross-disciplinary papers which look at nature and how nature was conceived in all of its forms, religion, and get this, you can also borrow papers from other faculties. So next door we've got the Divinity faculty, the Philosophy faculty, the History faculty, the English faculty, and the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. You can take papers from those if your interests have blossomed beyond the classical world itself. So all of that is open to you, as is a thesis of your own choice. Now, I'm coming to the end of the Cambridge side of things, but there is a big difference between Cambridge and Oxford. And that's, generally speaking, in Cambridge, you can't combine two different degrees. So I just mentioned the various other departments and how you can borrow a paper, but you can't do a joint degree, really, of classics and English, classics and history. That's just not something we've really got into in Cambridge. But there is one exception to that general rule, and that's classics and modern languages. So it's possible for you to study either Latin or ancient Greek, whether from scratch or based upon an A-level in one of those subjects, plus another modern language. And they wouldn't be fused in a lecture course which somehow unites them. You would study Latin literature and the Roman world, and separately Russian literature, and you would simply be doing the two simultaneously. About 3 or 4 people do this a year, so it's relatively rare, but we've had hundreds of people do it and enjoy it. And the novelty of that is because you're studying a modern language, which is still spoken somewhere, your third year is a year abroad among whatever speech community is speaking that modern language. So it's a 4-year degree, and it's down to you how classical or how modern you make it. So I think that's the end of the Cambridge side of things, so I'll hand over to Andrew.
Thank you very much. Is the microphone working? Maybe, yes, wonderful, excellent. The perceptive among you will have noticed that I'm not Gail Trimble. She is very sorry she can't be here with you today, and I'm sure she's even more sorry that I've been sent to talk in her stead. So if it looks like I am turning around and reading off the screen at various points, there's a reason for that, but I will do the very best I can to bring Gail's fantastic presentation to life. As she said, there are 2 main differences to bear in mind between the Oxford and the Cambridge Classics courses, and those come down to something that David mentioned at the end there, the number of joint schools that we offer. Oxford seems very keen on giving people the opportunity of combining different degrees into one course, and also the lengths that those courses can take. So in the main classics school, rather than having a 3-year and a 4-year option, everyone sits 4 years together. Here are the various different courses that you can take. Literae humaniores, the more human letters. The idea of that being, I suppose, a contrast with, say, divinity and theology or something, but anything to do with humans essentially comes under classics. And I think that's actually quite a nice way of thinking about it, the enormous breadth that you can take in with classics. Anything that relates to a human being in any way whatsoever can be studied under classics. So literae humaniores or classics, you might find either of those terms being used. That's our main classics school, full-fat classics, where you don't distract yourself with other schools. You stick to classics. Alongside that, we have our classics joint schools, where you would do half a degree in classics and half a degree in English literature. See if I can use the laser pointer. Oh, there we go, classics in English. Below that, classics and Oriental studies. Oriental studies is a slightly unusual phrase. Essentially, that for us means ancient languages from the ancient Near East, so things like Sanskrit, also, I suppose, Arabic in the more modern world, but essentially Asian languages, especially ancient ones, can be joined with classics. Classics are modern languages, slightly unusually modern languages, sort of means European languages for this, for these purposes, French, German, even Russian, Italian. And then alongside those, we have our joint schools with the history faculty. We have ancient and modern history, which, as the name suggests, is a combination of ancient history papers and modern history papers. You choose a combination of those. And then classical archaeology and ancient history, whereas rather than sort of splitting your degree between two different periods of time, the ancient world and the modern world, you approach the ancient world through two different ways. I suppose ancient history, perhaps looking at texts, what people have written about the ancient world, and classical archaeology, actually grabbing your spade and starting to dig up what you can find in the past, two different ways of looking at the ancient world. And I'll talk about those in a little bit of detail later on. Let's talk about literae humaniores first of all. So as David said, the big difference with Cambridge is that if you are coming up without having studied either ancient language to A-level or equivalent, for Cambridge you come up and do a year on your own to bring yourself up to speed. In Oxford, we throw everyone in together. This is the course that I did. I was a course 2 student once upon a time. And the idea behind, well, the way we make this work is that we are immensely privileged in Oxford to have a 4-year undergraduate degree. So an undergraduate degree that, rather than taking the usual 3 years, takes a full 4 years. And it's a purely historical accident that we have that, an undergraduate degree that takes 4 years. What we have done with that historical accident is make a virtue of that and say that we can use this large amount of time that we have to teach you everything you need to know completely from scratch. So whatever background you come from, whatever previous language training you have, we will give you the time and we will give you the resources and we will give you the attention you need to learn, if you wish, both of those languages to a high level. What we force you to do is make a choice at the very beginning. You have to choose if you're coming in without either language. Do you start with Latin or do you start with Greek? You learn one of those for the first 5 terms. Our first set of exams take place in the second term of your second year, so you get 5 terms worth of teaching. And then once you've done that, you move on to the second. So it falls more or less half and half. Half of the people start with Latin, which is what I did, and half start with Greek. But while you are having your beginning languages, you were also being taught alongside people who have come up with either one or both of those languages at A-level or equivalent. So if you have an A-level or equivalent in Latin, or an A-level equivalent in Greek, or both, you will be taught alongside people coming up without either, or people coming up with just one. And what that means is, I suppose, you have different streams of people going through, people moving through at different speeds. Some people come up with their A-level or equivalent languages and spend an awful lot of time reading texts straight from the beginning. The vast majority of people will come up needing to learn at least one language. So most people are coming in needing to learn at least one language from scratch. And so you'll start with intensive language learning, which we will take care of, and then you will be given the opportunity to go and read these texts for yourself. That takes until the first 5 terms, at which point you're examined together, and that's called mods. That's a term that you will find. Within mods, which is this first bit here, for your first 5 terms, you will be examined in a combination of language papers, translation into and out of ancient languages, but alongside that you will also be given an introduction to every aspect of the ancient world that we can think of. As I said, literae humaniores, anything to do with humans you will be introduced to. So that will be taking 2 main epic poems from the ancient world, Homer's Iliad and Virgil's Aeneid, which we think are somewhat foundational to ancient literature, an introduction to history and archaeology in texts and context, but you will also be given a philosophy option. Hardly anyone comes up with a philosophy A-level, but everyone is given the opportunity, indeed they have their arms twisted and are forced to do a philosophy option, which at the end, for some reason, they all end up loving, I guess, because no one is coming in with any expectation. So even if you're coming up with an A level in Latin and an A level in Greek, you are going to be forced to do things that you haven't done before in terms of philosophy. And you also have special subjects allowing, even at that early stage, for you to start specialising. Think about, what do I actually really like? What do I personally love about the ancient world? You can choose a particularly ancient history area, a particular part of Roman history, a particular part of Greek history. You can choose an archaeology option, looking at pots, looking at vases, looking at architecture. You can even look at philology, which is the science of languages, how languages work. And the idea of this in these first 5 terms is not only that after 5 terms will you be comfortable reading Latin and Greek texts on your own without our help, but you will also have a sense of what you like in the ancient world, what it is about the ancient world that you in particular find inspiring and intriguing. And what we do in the 6th term, so just at the start of your 2nd year, you've got 2 years waiting after that, is we let you loose on the 10s, 20s, 30s, more than 80 options that you have. We throw open the doors and say, pick your courses, whatever you want to do. You can choose options from ancient literature, options from ancient history. You can choose modern philosophy papers, ancient philosophy papers, archaeology, philosophy, linguistics, all of those areas. You can decide on the basis of what you like. You make your own degree in that case. And just as David said with Cambridge, no one comes out of Cambridge with exactly the same degree because they've chosen little different options, different bits of stickle bricks that they've glued together. That is exactly the same at Oxford. Not going to give away how old I am. I'm slightly old. I've taught quite a lot of undergraduates in my time, and I don't think I've ever taught an undergraduate who's done exactly the same set of options across. So I don't know, to make myself sound, I don't want to sound like a TED YouTube talk or something, but you can express yourself. You can use this degree to express yourself. It's about what you find interesting. You haul your way through that and you put together a course that you want to do that speaks to you. And that's the best way to get through one of these degrees, right? To enjoy yourself. You choose the options that you like. An option for that also is a thesis or an extended essay, but we'll talk about that a little later when we get on to different ways of teaching. That, however, is just one way of studying classics, the literae humaniores. It's just one way of studying classics at Oxford. Alongside that, you also have these joint schools. You have 2 different ways of studying these, essentially, and they sort of split down the middle here. Classics and Oriental Studies and Classics and Modern Languages I'll take together because they're slightly similar. For those language-based joint schools, you have 2 ways of doing those. You can do those either as, I suppose, a long degree, where you do that 5-term language learning stuff that I was talking about, do those 5 terms, and then slide into your joint part of your degree. So you can do almost 2 years as just doing classics, right? Doing classics like anyone else, any other normal, one awful phrase to use, any other boring classics student who doesn't want to do one of these joint schools. Do 5 terms with everyone else, join together, and then when everyone else is going into the classics handbook to choose their options, you are given 2 handbooks. You are given the the classics handbook and the handbook for French, for German, for Arabic, for Sanskrit, and you choose options from that to make up your 8 options, right? So if you have 8 options to choose from for your finals, most classicists will do 8 from the classics one. You would do 4 from each. Another possibility is to do it as a shorter degree, so to do Oriental Studies. Well, okay, no, I'll abandon that thought, sticking with modern languages because that's slightly simpler. You can do I suppose, a 3-year option, 3 years plus the 1 year year abroad, where we speed you very quickly through your language learning in just 1 year. We give you preliminary language exams, and then after 1 year of doing that, you jump straight into doing more French and more German. You study that alongside. In all of these cases, for the modern languages ones, the year abroad is guaranteed. Everyone doing a joint school does a year abroad as a classics and modern language person, and it takes place in your penultimate year, right? So whichever version you do, you will end up doing your year abroad in your penultimate year, so just before the end. Classics and English is slightly different. Classics and English is always 3 years of full-on classics and English teaching, so that preliminary language thing. So you would begin by doing 1 year of classics and English papers with the language learning built into that, and then 2 further years building towards finals, your final set of exams, also split between the two. However, if you are a Course 2 student, which is to say someone who is coming up without either of those languages, it's a very popular option, incidentally, for Course 2 students, classics and English, you would have something slightly more akin to the Cambridge system, where you have a full year of language learning in just one of the languages for your first part, and then given an option to take the rest later on. So those are the joint schools with classics, and then you have these 2 extra ones which are properly historically focused: classical archaeology and ancient history, and ancient and modern history. I'm not going to read out everything behind me because you can read that in the handbooks, but I think it's important just to think about it as 2, as I said at the beginning, actually 2 different ways of studying the ancient world. Rather than taking an approach to the ancient world which says that I want the opportunity to look at absolutely everything, right? I'm coming in, I don't know anything about classics. I want to have the option of choosing absolutely anything I like. That's the good classics degree. If you are certain that what you want to study is the history of the ancient world, and you don't want to spend your time learning those languages, you don't want to, it's hard work, right? Learning a language will help you, but it is hard work. If you want to skip that part and just get straight into reading these texts, then ancient and modern history and classical archaeology and ancient history might be for you. As I said, with ancient and modern history, you are splitting between half a set of ancient papers, history papers set in the ancient world, and half chosen from the modern history syllabus. So for that, there'll be a combination of medieval papers, modern papers, British papers, global papers, and half will be taken from the ancient source. For classical archaeology and ancient history, you are sticking in the ancient world. Much like for AMH, you are spending 3 years purely looking at the history of the ancient world. What are you making up for? How are you getting an equally good education as the literae humaniores people? Well, we are going to teach you how to work out what's really going on in the ancient world, actually digging down and finding what's in the ground. What can we learn about the ancient world that doesn't just come from reading these texts really closely? It's a growing degree. It's a fantastic degree, and it's one of the ones that we're proudest of, actually, as a faculty. We're really very proud of our classical archaeology and ancient history degree, and if you wish to bother the people at the stand there, they'll be more than happy to enthuse to you about it. For both of these, there is the option to study the ancient languages. So if you do feel that you want to study those ancient languages alongside that, that is an option for these papers, but it's not compulsory. What happens if I press the next thing here? Teaching. Is this now me as well? This is me as well. So putting back on my Gale hat here. I spoke a little earlier about how privileged Oxford is to have this 4-year accident undergraduate degree and what that allows us to do. A privilege that Oxford and Cambridge share. You can see various people in the admissions office sort of shaking their head at me and asking me to stop using the word privilege in this case, but I mean privilege in a sort of positive sense. An immense privilege that we would like to share with you, I suppose is a nice way of phrasing that, is a commitment to small group teaching, essentially a commitment to the belief that the best way for us to educate bright young people is just to sit them in a room with us, right? Take a tutor, take a student, sit them down together and have them talk individually. And we call this the tutorial system in Oxford, and you call it the supervision system, I believe, in Cambridge. This is a very precious gift and something that you won't find at other universities to anything like the same degree. A default mode of teaching here is the idea that the smaller the group, the greater the interaction between the tutor or the supervisor and the undergraduate is what will produce the best results. It's extraordinarily expensive. Anyone who is trying to balance the books at Oxford and Cambridge University would probably love to be able to cut this out of the way because it costs them a huge amount of money. If they could just teach you in enormous rooms like this over YouTube, that would be perfect. We have to fight very hard to hold on to it, and the reason we fight for it is because we believe in it. We believe it produces the best results possible, that the best way to exchange ideas is through conversation, right? What we will do for a tutorial or for a supervision is you will have one of those a week for an option. You will be given a reading list in advance. You will write an essay for that tutorial, and then you will have, well, we call it an Oxford hour, which is 50 minutes, 5 minutes before and 5 minutes afterwards, but an hour's conversation with an expert, or if you're unlucky, you get to talk to me, but you might get to talk to an expert in the field like David. What could be better than that, right? You prepare a topic, you are both ready to discuss it, and you sit down face to face and discuss it. And we think that is the ultimate way to increase the sum of knowledge that's going along. And that is something that we both believe in. Both universities are committed to this. And in many ways, as Dave said, there is a choice that you have to make at this faculty open day. We have to choose between Oxford and Cambridge. But in many ways, you've already made the right choice by coming here or by tuning in to this. Deciding to do classics or a classics-related degree, you've already chosen the best possible degree you could do. But also saying that you would like to engage in this system, this rigorous system of sitting down with an expert and talking to them face to face, you have absolutely made the right choice. It's brave to do that, and I'm really glad that you're considering that. So I think that's what's special about Oxford and Cambridge. That's not to say that that's the entirety of your degree. Supplementing the supervisions and the tutorials are lectures, which are, I suppose, far more clear than what I'm doing here, but an intense ordnance delivery system, like an enormous ballistic missile, carries the most knowledge in the shortest amount of time. If you like, 1 hour, an expert just talking to you about a subject. No better way to bring you up to speed on something you thought you knew nothing about, right? Say you're doing Roman history and you've never studied Roman history before. 1 8-week subject on the fall of the Republic. So 8-week lecture series in these short terms that we have, you will feel like an expert by the end of that. It will give you the background that you need to talk in those tutorials. We are also experimenting with these fancy things, seminars, which is the idea that because you are all bright individuals, you should be able to teach yourselves, and we should be able to sit back and just have a coffee and let you teach each other. The seminar system is one that tries to get students talking to each other in that case, right? So getting a larger group of students, maybe 5, 6, maybe 7 or 8, giving them individual assignments and having them talk to each other in a way that we as the tutors, I suppose, would chair in that. It's like conducting a symphony, making you teach each other. We'll find more and more of those, but they supplement our tutorial system rather than replace it. Classes are similar to those. But the thing that we would also like to stress, 1 hour a week doesn't feel like very much contact time, right? 1 hour of that supervision. That isn't just because we're very lazy and would far rather be doing our own research than talking to undergraduates. It's not purely about that. But one thing that we do like to encourage is independent learning. Right, taking responsibility for your own learning. So giving people a reading list and telling them that your job over the next 6 days, 7 days if you're very quick in handing out your reading lists. I think my students usually get 3 or 4 days. But you get 7 days to go to the library, follow up this reading list and come up with your own ideas there, that the tutorial is the final stage in that. We try to encourage the sense of independent learning, bringing yourself to the situation where you're able to discuss this intelligently. And finally, fieldwork and practical training. If you are taking one of those wonderful archaeology options, the ability to be flown out at the college's expense or taking the train somewhere to actually dive into a trench and start scrabbling around in the dirt, searching for what the ancient world was actually like, is something both faculties are very keen to introduce you to. Not just in the classical archaeology and ancient history part, but in both of our degrees, whatever you're taking, there are options for doing this. And I think I will stop talking there and hand over to David to talk about.
Very good. Thank you, Andrew. So hopefully we've convinced you of at least one course, maybe several courses that you've seen, and they appeal to you as a possible thing to apply to. So we're probably going to speak for about 10 more minutes before we open up for questions. So I'm going to go quite quickly through the Cambridge side of things, some of which will be familiar to you already, perhaps. So you apply through UCAS. There's a deadline, typically in October. You choose a college in Cambridge to apply to. We've got 31 colleges. All of them offer spaces in classics, but if you can't decide, you can have an open application where you're assigned to a college that has had fewer applications in that year. Generally, you will have 2, but perhaps 3 interviews, which are organised by the college you applied to, but will necessarily involve people from other colleges giving a second interview, a second perspective, as they talk to you and gauge what excites you about the classics and have a conversation, which doesn't test what you know, but rather engages you in a discussion and sees how you think when different bits of evidence are presented. If you're applying for the 3-year course, as you'll have seen, the Latin A-level is typical for that. And there is a centralised 1-hour Latin test where you're given a passage of Latin with an hour to translate it. And that serves as just one of many bits of data that we weigh up. We accept people to the course who don't do particularly well on that Latin test, and we end up not making offers to people who've aced that Latin test, but we felt weren't so well suited for the course as a whole. So it's just part of the picture. But if you haven't studied Latin and you're applying for the 4-year course, clearly we're not so cruel or demented as to test you on the Latin you've never studied. Instead, we try to gauge how you think about different types of languages. And we'll often invent a language which no one by definition knows, and we'll see how you think about the building blocks of how languages work. And again, your performance in that general language assessment would be one of literally scores of bits of information we make a decision on. The college you apply to will probably ask you to send 2 pieces of work. Typically, these are pieces of work from the classroom. They might be on Latin or Greek if you've studied those languages. They might be on classical civilization, or they could be on something completely different. Clearly, we only want you to send in work that fits what you've studied up to this point. Just to reassure you, if you're perhaps wondering whether everyone in the room around you has studied Latin and Greek and they're all set up for the 3-year degree, the rarest applicant we get is the person who's done Latin and Greek. And then we have about an equal number of applicants between those who've studied some Latin and those who've studied no Latin, okay? So the shrinking and rarer type of undergraduate is the one who has Latin and Greek. The other really important thing I forgot to say earlier, in my moment of madness, is that everyone who comes to Cambridge and does the classics degree is taught Latin and ancient Greek for their first 2 or 3 years, okay? So in your final year, you can do whatever you want. You may not read any Latin or Greek, but everyone here at Cambridge does learn Latin and ancient Greek. We're the only university in the country, I think, where that is the case. So in the blue box, there's the information that may count. Our typical offer for A-level is A-star AA, but it's very rare that we stipulate what the A-star is in. You simply have to achieve that. If you're in the Scottish system, 3 A's in advanced hires, and IB, generally somewhere in the low 40s with 776 is standard practice. But that will be based upon your college, based upon your interviewers making the decision, which correlates with your own circumstances. One thing that Oxford and Cambridge are exceptionally serious about is treating your applications contextually. So not just the educational nature of your school, but also we have access to all sorts of socioeconomic data, your personal circumstances, the pandemical complications, etc. And we really do treat you as an individual and contextualize your application within that. So here's Andrew on the Oxford side.
And I think what I would say is basically everything about our system is more or less identical to Cambridge's system, with just a few tiny differences. If you're taking the Literae Humaniores, if you're applying for the Literae Humaniores course, you will also have a language test. We want to see how your languages are, and you will be given a test, a translation test, in whatever language you have an A-level in, whatever ancient language you have an A-level in. So if you've done ancient Greek and Latin, you'll be tested in both of those. If you've just done Latin, you'll just have one in Latin, and I don't know, if you were raised on a Greek fishing boat and you've only done A-level Greek, ancient Greek, and not Latin, then you'll only be examined in that. If you're coming up without either of those, then just like with Cambridge, there will be a special language aptitude test to see how you deal with being given new languages. We will also make up. We should probably pool our resources there and stop making up 2 separate languages each year. Yes, we will also make up a language to see how you deal when you're given one of these languages. There's something very different, I suppose, about learning an ancient language where you can't go on holiday and talk to people in that. How do you learn these things? And exactly as David says with Cambridge, it is absolutely not a test where we just put everyone in an order and admit the top 20, right? It is something that gives us data that will help us to understand your application. It's helpful contextually. It's in no way a barrier that you need to flip over. And in exactly the same way, we've not taken people who have aced the test, and we have taken people who would not have been very happy with how the thing goes. There are so many explanations as to how these things happen. So this is taken at your school. Just give it your best shot and trust us to read those marks fairly. That goes for joint schools where you are doing a language, so the classics joint schools, classics and modern languages, classics and English, classics and Oriental studies all have that language test. If you're doing ancient and modern history or classical archaeology and ancient history, you do not need to do the language test. The only difference really is that our standard offer is 3 A's rather than 2 A's and an A star, and that's the idea behind that isn't that we're necessarily less rigorous than Cambridge, but that we are still waiting on the data to see what that A star says about various students. So I don't read anything into the difference between those. One thing you'll probably feel like doing when you're doing your Oxford or your Cambridge application is worrying about the college that you're going to choose. It feels like it's going to be a massive deal. All of the colleges, I can't speak for Cambridge, but I'm sure this is true, certainly all of the colleges that admit for classics in Oxford are fantastic. I'm certain that goes for Cambridge as well. I chose my college alphabetically. I thought I won't choose Balliol, because Balliol's at the top of the list. Everyone's going to apply for that. I'll choose Brasenose, because that's second. That's as good a reason as any. That was before the open offer existed. Now, if you can't make your mind up, just put in an open offer and you'll be assigned a college. You also can't guarantee that the college that you apply to will be the one you get into. You could be pooled to a different one. So do not worry about the college bit. You will be bombarded with information about different colleges as you take your application forward, as if that's the most important thing in the world. When you're actually at that college, it feels like it's very important, but everyone feels that their college was the only one they could go to. So don't worry about it. Choose the right subject. Make sure that classics or a classics joint school is the right subject for you, and then just close your eyes and pick a college at random. I don't think there's anything more that I need to say about that differs from that, so I'll move on to the next slide, which is just to say, David began by saying why you should like classics, right? Why the study of classics is the best subject of all the ones you can do, why classics touches on everything else. But we are in a marketplace in this case. So why will classics make you better people? Why will it be a sensible return on your investment? Well, all of the skills that are given up here that Dr. Trimble has put together are ones that we particularly feel classics puts forward, and classics and joint schools. And I'm not going to read those out because that will be poor presentation style. But what I will do is flip forward to the next skill, which is what all the mums and dads and carers really want to see, which is what job can you do with a classics degree? Why on earth would you do that? Well, look at all of these jobs. Because I'm the sort of very sad individual who sort of put his social life in aspic at the age of 18, almost all of my friends are classicists who I met at one time or another. And a situation I found myself in as a classicist who just kept doing classics is that whenever my friends get married, I could never afford to go on the stag do's. And whenever the wedding gift list are put out, I have to go very, very quickly to make sure that the cheapest things aren't taken. And that is because, seemingly, if you do your classics degree, unless you become a classics teacher or an academic, you become fabulously wealthy. So many of my friends got snapped up by law firms very, very quickly because there is something about the, I guess, the analytical nature of our degree, that ability to process large amounts of complex information very, very quickly and to present that not only clearly to a third person, to a third party, but with your own interpretation put on top of that, is a skill that is particularly beloved by the law, but almost any career, that's what you're going to have to do, right? Almost any career is someone better paid than you asking you to read something for them and to tell you what it says and whether it's a good idea or not. In a sense, we teach you that impeccably well. That's one of the great things about the supervision or tutorial system. The civil service, the law, but also if you are one of those creative people, and academia is sort of creative, but another aspect of classics, that desire to absolutely drench yourself in the details of another culture, the desire just to say, I'm going to choose the Romans, I'm going to choose the Greeks, and I'm going to learn absolutely everything I can. I'm going to do everything I can to get under the skin of this culture. Well, I think it makes you deeply empathetic human beings. I think it makes you good people in a sort of morally virtuous sense. But I think it also makes you very creative. It makes you very aware of the differences between different cultures. It makes you extraordinarily respectful of those sorts of things. And that's wanted by all HR departments anyway, but it also makes people extraordinarily creative as well. So the slightly more creative things there can be found. And I'm sure if you talk to people at the various stands, they'll be able to tell you all the sort of weird, wacky jobs their students have gone on to do. I think that's the thing to leave up here and talk through, but I suspect that's the end of our talk. And we can
Yep, that's the end of our information, but it's always the case that among you there are some questions coming out, either out of what we've said or things that you think we should have covered but haven't said anything about. We've certainly got 10 minutes for questions. I'm not sure whether we'll be passing a mic around. We will be? Yep, okay. So if you could raise your hand, should you have a question for Andrew or me? We'll be delighted to answer it as best we can. There's a question there and there's a question here. So do you want this mic? Yep. Lovely. Okay. So we'll start at the front and then go back there.
Hi, thank you. I was going to ask for the option for Oriental Studies where you mentioned studying things like Arabic or Hebrew. I found that really interesting, but I wondered whether we have to have previous study to take such an option.
In Cambridge, no. Whatever language outside the classical world you want to study, that can be taught from scratch, and the great majority of people who do that option here are doing it from scratch. And that's exactly the same in Cambridge. We don't expect anyone to come up with an A-level in Sanskrit or even in Hebrew, which is slightly more taken. In modern languages as well, you can take things ab initio, but you will want to have a look in the handbook to check exactly what the details of that are. But yes, that's absolutely yes. One thing you can't do in Cambridge if you do classics and a modern language, both languages can't be from scratch. So you could have Latin A-level and do German from scratch, or you could have German A-level and do Latin from scratch, but you do need one of them. Okay, that question just up that way. Can you
just while that's found, I'll just say yes, you can do that in Oxford, so it's a 5-year degree. That's right. A proper, that's a thing.
It's a shift.
Thank you. How does the content of what's taught in the tutorials or the supervisions vary across the college, and is that ever a factor in choosing which college you would like to apply to if there was that interest?
That's a great question. As we've said many times, classics is a huge, broad subject. So if you're speaking to an expert, it's typical that the expert is actually employed at another college and you are sent there as a student from one college to be taught by that expert. So if you spent time making a big database of how many fellows there are at a college and what their specialities are, it would be wrong to conclude that the college with 4 Roman historians is going to give you a more history-rich degree than the college that only has 1 fellow who works on, Greek archaeology. Instead, all the colleges work together and ensure that for every tutorial or supervision you do, you are speaking to an expert. So I wouldn't overthink the particular details of who is based at a college, unless on the personal level you would like to spend particular amounts of time with a person at a given college. Academically, we offer the same experience.
Yeah, and I guarantee if you do try and choose because you like that particular academic, they will get a new job, or they will get a huge amount of money on be on leave for the entire time. So there's no point trying to game the system in that.
Quite so.
So sorry, so do you mean that whichever college you're at, you get a similar content of your tutorials as to somebody at another college because the syllabus is organised like that?
Yes, I'd say two things are the same. One, you would have the same amount of teaching on the same subjects, and quite often you would have the self-same academic teaching you at College X, where you've visited from College Y, and the people at College X have the same experience. So it's a collective endeavour, and there are no material differences either in quality or in the amount of teaching you would get.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, there's a few questions up that way. I can see one at the front.
Thank you. So at Oxford, when you pick up a new ancient language for the first 5 terms, at what point do you reach A-level standard? And does this vary if you're doing a joint honours degree?
Thank you. It doesn't vary if you're doing a joint honours degree. You're put in the same language classes as everyone else. I think probably it will differ from class to class, right? So one of the reasons that we're quite glad that so many people who come up are starting at least one language from scratch is that we have a lot of different classes to play with, and therefore we can tailor individual classes quite carefully to the strength of people's linguistic skills, for example. So when they take their language aptitude tests, or when they take their latter stuff, we have a rough idea of how strong a linguist you might be coming in sort of completely fresh, not language potential, but how strong you might be. And therefore we can create classes quite well that might spend a bit more time doing the basics, or others where you might take the basics for granted. Everyone does the same amount of teaching within the first 2 terms of that 5 terms. That's all organised by the faculty. So maybe on some vague level, you'd say that everyone should feel quite happy about their languages by the end of the first 2 terms, but after that, for the next 3 terms, the colleges take over individually and will start doing some really tailored teaching to those needs. So for some people, they'll probably be at A-level standard halfway through the 2nd term. For others, they'll get to it later on, but they will all be made ready for the exam in time. Yeah. If only there was some sort of Aesop fable to convey that. Tortoise and Hare College.
Okay, thank you for that. Other questions? Put your hand up nice and high. Oh, hello.
So we've had quite a few questions come through on the live stream.
Oh, yes, of course.
Is it possible to ask a few of those? Okay, so one person says, I'm studying Greek but not Latin. Is that a disadvantage? And in practice, how many students are there who take Greek but not Latin A-level?
I think there are very few people who take only Greek and not Latin A-level in the UK. I'd be amazed if it's more than 10. I think it will be 1, 2 or 3 people. So they're quite rare to apply to either of our universities. Is there an advantage? Well, on the one hand, they've experienced an ancient language, but on the other hand, once they arrive here, they're not going to be in a special position which makes life easier for them. Wherever someone's Latin or Greek is, we push them on. So everyone is trying to become a better linguist. So I would simply recommend that person, if they are a sole Greek learner, be excited about learning Latin and apply to either of our universities.
Thank you. Do you want to back? There are quite a few more. Should I keep going?
What we can probably do is those questions, I suppose, could be answered by someone typing. So we can come to those after the room separates. Obviously, anyone in the room can come and speak to us at the end or speak at the stalls, but there are doubtless some good questions to raise now, so please keep your hand up if you'd like to ask one.
We will, of course, be around during the stalls, so
We'll
don't
be
feel
around.
you've missed your opportunity if you don't get called.
So both classics courses at Oxford and Cambridge are very diverse and cover different areas, philosophy and literature, but would you say that one university offers slightly more?
Sorry, we'll repeat it. So, yeah.
Both classics courses at Oxford and Cambridge are very diverse, but would you say that one university offers a slightly more language-focused course than the other?
Okay, so question is, does one of our universities offer a more language-focused course than the other? My personal answer is no. You've got to do Latin and Greek at Cambridge on the one hand, but in your final year, which is the only year where you actually are examined formally for your degree, it's all based upon the last year, you could do no Latin or Greek. So it's language heavy, but then language light if you want it to be. We've seen at Oxford that there are courses without Latin and Greek, but if you do the languages, it's fully rigorous, equally rigorous.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So we obviously like to pride ourselves on our language, on our ability to teach language really well, just because of that historical accident of having 4 years to play with. So it's not that our teachers are any better than the Cambridge teachers, or that we as academics are more committed to it or anything like that, but we do just have this extra amount of time to play with. So when you find that stressed in our material, it's because we think it's important. Cambridge thinks it's important as well. We just have a slightly more room to play with in that regard.
Yep, that's all true.
I've been told that doing a joint honours degree, so for example, classics and English, would be almost like taking 1.5 degree. Like, is that something that's true or myth or?
I think one of the things that, I'll just take this because classics and English is obviously an Oxford thing. There's always the risk, right, that you can end up having to do far more work on both sides because neither side is prepared to compromise with the other. I suspect maybe once upon a time when these degrees were quite new, that might have been true. I think now there's a lot more communication between the two sides to make sure that you're not sort of overworking yourself in that regard, and far more have to make sure that there are papers that link the two together, right? So papers on tragedy or papers on epic that try and link the two together. So you don't come out of it with a better degree than anyone else, but you also don't come out with it, sort of putting twice the work in for half the reward in that case. I think a lot of the myths around those are set back in time. The other good thing about the joint schools is it does force you to, that independent learning thing that I was talking about, it forces you to take a lot of responsibility for your own learning in that way, because you sort of have to be the go-between for the two parts. So I think it often makes very mature students, which is no bad thing.
Thank you.
Okay, we've probably got time for two more questions before you head on. Yep.
I've heard of people that have studied classics at Oxford and Cambridge and then gone on to do conversion courses to become a lawyer. But is that something that's offered at either university, or would you have to leave and do it somewhere else?
So neither of our universities offers a natural route out of classics into the legal add-on bit. However, between us, we will have taught probably the best part of 100 people, if not more, who have done exactly that. And anecdotally, we hear from legal firms that they prefer undergraduates who've done classics and then come to the law, rather than those who pass through a law degree. So there are lots of routes, even if it might mean you change college, change institution to do that conversion course.
Thank you.
Do we have time for two more? I can see two hands. Oh.
Okay, yeah, whatever you fancy.
Hi, can you hear me through the mask?
Why not?
How many contact hours per subject or paper a week? And what's the difference between classes and seminars?
I suppose this was my bit, wasn't it? It can change depending on which part of your degree you're in. So at Oxford, we generally go in the first half of the degree from having sort of one tutorial per week to going towards 2 tutorials per week in the second half. Alongside that, you will have a certain number of lectures in both sides. But in the first half, I suppose what makes up for that is lots of language classes in that regard. So it's quite a difficult question to answer without getting really into very, very micro details. So I won't give you a specific number, not least because it would be quite easily falsified for various other people's experience. The difference between a seminar and a class, I guess probably a seminar has probably one main leader and other people respond to that, whereas a class probably has more leadership roles within it. So each student is probably equally committed to leading the class, whereas in a seminar, someone has been given the job of leading that, usually alongside a lecturer.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so, some of those classes are language classes, which are centrally organised in the way you'd understand. Okay, maybe a closing question. If you haven't managed to ask a question, as we say, we're around all day. Just at the back there then.
So if you're going to take a modern foreign language and a classics kind of joint degree, would you study 3 languages, so Greek, Latin, and your chosen modern foreign language? And this would be for Cambridge specifically. And do you study the language as well as the culture and the history of that modern foreign language, or do you just study purely the language in conjunction with the classics degree?
Sure, thank you. That's a great question. And the answer is simple. You can only do the Latin or the Greek side alongside your modern language, just so that you've got enough time in the day to combine the two. But when you focus on Latin or Greek, that really means the Roman or the Greek world, and you would mix the language and the literature with the aspects of antiquity that interest you. So we can't offer Latin and Greek and a modern language. You would make the choice, but you would have a fully immersive study of that side of the ancient world.
Whereas for Oxford, we do offer all of those, but again, that's because we have more time to play with in that regard.
Wow.
In practice, though, most people end up specialising just because of the amount of time that there is, but the option is open in that regard, in the long form of the degree.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your patience, everyone. Thank you for coming physically here or tuning on online.